Welcome and relax. Take a moment to settle in, breathe deeply, and let your mind drift. Feel the quiet around you, the gentle rhythm of your thoughts, and the calm that surrounds this moment. Listen and simply be. Long before words were written down, before ink, before paper, before books, humans were already telling stories. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, naturally, as part of living. Stories lived in the rhythm of footsteps across familiar land. They lived in the crackle of firelight at the end of the day. They lived in the pauses between breaths as people sat together in soft shadow. A story might begin with something simple, a hunt that went well, a storm that came too suddenly, an animal that behaved in an unexpected way, or even the soft rustle of leaves signaling change. But as it was shared, it slowly became something more. Details were remembered, lessons were repeated, warnings were passed along without needing command. Every repetition added nuance, a quiet rhythm that connected one person's memory to another's. Stories helped humans navigate a dangerous world. They remembered where rivers overflowed, which paths were safe, which seasons brought hunger, and which brought rest. In a world without maps, stories became direction. In a world without calendars, stories became time. Stories shaped the night as much as the day. As people gathered around fires, the flickering light painting gentle shadows across their faces, voices lowered, not to command attention, but to invite listening. There was no hurry here. The world itself moved slowly. So did the stories. Each word carried weight, not loud, not urgent, but quiet. And in the pauses, the unspoken spaces between sentences, understanding settled gently in the mind. Stories gave shape to things that could not otherwise be held. A strange sound in the dark became a creature with intention. A changing sky became a sign. Loss became something that could be spoken and shared. Stories gave shape to fear, so fear could be carried together. They gave shape to hope, so hope could last longer than a single heartbeat. Even children listened, not because they were told to, but because something in them recognized the rhythm, something that had always been part of being human. Stories didn't demand attention, they earned it, slowly, carefully, like water carving paths through stone. And in this quiet exchange, voice to ear, memory to memory, something remarkable began to grow. Humans were not just surviving anymore, they were remembering, they were connecting, they were learning who they were by telling each other who they had been. And stories began to travel, from one fire to another, from one group to the next, changing slightly each time, but carrying the same essence, a shared understanding, a shared past, a shared sense that life was more than what could be seen. Over time, stories became more intricate. They contained patterns. They wove lessons into the rhythm of words. They marked seasons and events. They shaped the earliest sense of culture without anyone planning it consciously. Sometimes a story was playful, a quiet game passed down around a fire. Sometimes it was solemn, a memory of loss, a warning, a guide. Stories gave humans their first sense of what it meant to belong. By listening, by repeating, each person became part of something larger, a community not just of bodies in space, but of minds and time. And so, without realizing it, humans began to weave something invisible, something that would outlast footprints in the soil, something that would travel beyond the individual, beyond the night, even beyond the life of the storyteller. A story that could move through time. And as the fire burned lower and the night stretched outward, the first storytellers rested in the quiet comfort of knowing their voices, their words, would carry meaning long after the echoes faded. In this way, humans became something more than mere survivors. They became keepers of memory, weavers of connection, quiet architects of imagination. All of this began with a simple act, a voice, a listener, and the willingness to pause and remember together. Stories, once simple, began to do something new. They created a sense of belonging. Around fires, under open skies, humans realized that telling a story was not just about sharing information, it was about sharing identity. It was about saying, silently, "This is who we are. This is what matters to us." One story could describe a family. Another story could describe a group, a village, a community. And slowly, the lines between individual memory and collective memory blurred. When people shared a story, they were also sharing themselves, their fears, their hopes, their triumphs, their losses. And those listening absorbed it, not just as knowledge, but as understanding of another's life, understanding of a shared life. Stories began to mark roles, too. The hunter who brought back game, the gatherer who knew the rhythms of the land, the healer who remembered which plant soothed, which harmed. By speaking these stories aloud, the group reinforced patterns that helped them live together. They reinforced respect. They reinforced connection. They reinforced identity. Even small details mattered. How one acted in a storm, which path was safest when the river overflowed, which words soothed a frightened child. And these details were remembered through repetition, through rhythm, through storytelling. Over time, certain stories became central, stories that everyone in the group knew, stories that could be whispered to a child or spoken aloud in a quiet ceremony, stories that formed the invisible threads holding the group together. Some stories were cautionary. They warned against danger, not with fear, but with gentle guidance. Other stories celebrated courage, skill, or kindness, and some were simply playful, bringing laughter and the long, dark night. But all were important. All contributed to a shared sense of belonging. Even silence became part of the story. The pauses, the attentive listening, the quiet acknowledgement of others' experiences. Stories also shaped imagination. Through narrative, humans began to understand the world as more than what could be touched or seen. Animals, rivers, wind, fire, all could have meaning. All could carry lessons. All could be woven into the identity of the listener and the speaker alike. In these moments, humans were doing more than surviving. They were building culture. They were inventing morality, ritual, and ethics. They were shaping the frameworks that would guide generations to come. And with each retelling, stories adapted. They shifted slightly to fit new circumstances, new listeners, new landscapes. Yet their essence, the identity and values they carried, remained intact. It is remarkable when we reflect on it how something as ephemeral as a story could hold so much weight, how it could carry knowledge, emotion, and guidance across years, across spaces, across lifetimes. Stories were also a mirror. They reflected human behavior back to the group, revealing who they were, who they wanted to be, and who they had been. A story about courage did not only inspire courage, it reminded the community that courage existed among them, quietly in ordinary acts. A story about loss reminded them of resilience. A story about cleverness reminded them of the value of thought and observation. As the first stories of belonging spread, humans began to understand themselves in relation to one another. They began to see that their actions mattered beyond the immediate moment. Their words mattered beyond the firelit circle, and the way they treated others became part of the story too. Even the smallest acts, a shared meal, a helping hand, a gentle word could enter the story. They became part of the narrative that defined the group. Through stories, humans learned that they were part of something larger than themselves. And yet, even as stories became shared identity, they remained flexible. They allowed for individuality. They allowed for new voices, new experiences, new perspectives. The story could grow just as humans could grow. In this way, stories were both foundation and horizon. They grounded humans in a shared reality while opening their minds to imagination, reflection, and empathy. Stories created continuity. They connected the living to the remembered past. They created trust between generations. They formed invisible bridges over the uncertainty of life. And as humans continued to speak, listen, and remember, stories began to spread beyond the local group, traveling along rivers, across plains, through valleys. Stories became vessels of connection, carrying identity and belonging to distant communities. In all of this, the pattern was simple yet profound. Stories were told slowly. Stories were heard attentively. Stories were remembered. Stories became part of who humans were. And in the quiet moments between words, as firelight flickered and shadows danced, humanity learned something essential. Stories were not just tales. They were the heartbeat of connection, the threads of belonging, the quiet architecture of society itself. As humans gathered, stories became more than identity and belonging. They became tools for understanding the world. Through stories, knowledge was preserved. A story about which plants could heal, a story about which river currents were safe to cross, a story about which stars guided the night journey. All these were encoded in narrative, not in lists or rules, but in vivid memory, bound to experience. Stories allowed humans to teach without speaking like a teacher. They shared lessons naturally. When a child asked why a river flooded, a story might unfold. How ancestors had watched the river rise, how the land around it learned to bend with the flow, and how people survived because they observed and remembered. Through these stories, children learned not just facts, but patterns, attention, caution, and curiosity. They absorbed the rhythm of life as much as its content. They learned to see the world through the eyes of those who had come before them. Stories were also powerful because they made abstract ideas concrete. A tale about courage during a hunt became more than an example. It became a model. A fable about fairness or kindness shaped social expectations. People remembered not because they were told to, but because the narrative carried feeling, imagery, and consequence. And over time, stories became shared culture. They held festivals, rituals, and songs within them. The same tale could be told at dawn, at dusk, in the center of a village, or by a wandering traveler. It adapted slightly to fit new contexts, but its essence remained. In quiet circles around fires, humans experimented with storytelling techniques. They noticed which phrases made people lean in, which pauses built tension, which repeated motifs created memory and anticipation. Even the landscape itself became part of the story. A mountain, a river bend, a grove of trees, each could carry a narrative, a marker of lessons or past events. Humans learned to read and remember through observation as well as narration. The stories grew richer as humans became more complex. Communities traded ideas, experiences, and techniques through storytelling. A story about crafting tools could spread across rivers and valleys. A story about navigating a storm could reach distant settlements. Stories carried both practical and imaginative knowledge. They taught survival and strategy, but also values, dreams, and shared wonder. They reminded humans that the world was more than immediate perception. It had history, mystery, and consequence. And as these stories spread, they created networks of shared understanding. Humans began to sense that others far away might hold similar experiences. A story of survival on one river could resonate with a group on another river. A tale of a clever trick could inspire ingenuity elsewhere. Through narrative, humans began to connect across space, as they had already connected across time. Stories also allowed for reflection and anticipation. Humans could imagine consequences before they happened. They could learn from the past without repeating every mistake. They could model behavior for others quietly through narrative. The emotional dimension of stories strengthened this cultural transmission. A story told with care, with pauses, with attention to detail, left impressions deeper than spoken advice or practical instruction alone. Humans remembered not just what happened, but how it felt. Joy, fear, curiosity, wonder, all became embedded in the lessons. Even small gestures became significant within stories. The way a person helped a neighbor during a storm, the way a group shared food during scarcity, the way an individual respected tradition while adapting to change. All of this was recorded not in paper or ink, but in memory, voice, and action. Stories shaped the moral and ethical frameworks of communities long before written codes. They created standards, expectations, and shared values, and they carried these across generations. Stories also allowed humans to explore imagination safely. A tale of a beast in the forest or a mysterious sky phenomenon taught both caution and curiosity. It allowed listeners to experiment with ideas without taking physical risks. Stories became mental simulations, guiding behavior and expanding understanding. And as humans traveled, traded, and encountered other groups, stories crossed boundaries. A tale could change slightly with each retelling, picking up new elements, dropping old ones, and merging with other stories. Culture became fluid, adaptable, yet rooted in the rhythm of narrative memory. Stories were the first libraries, the first schools, the first courts of shared judgment. They shaped expectation and guided interaction. They carried wisdom and innovation. They provided entertainment, but always with a function beyond mere amusement. Even as humans slept, rested, or walked through familiar paths, stories remained. They lingered in memory, in whispered retellings, in silent reflection. They gave continuity,
structure, and meaning, and they quietly wove humans into culture itself, into something larger than individual existence. Through storytelling, humans learned that life could be observed, remembered, and shared, that knowledge could survive beyond the individual, that wisdom, care, and imagination could travel silently from one person to another, one generation to the next. And so, as humans continued to speak and listen, the world slowly transformed. Memory became culture, culture became community, and community became history, long before the first written word appeared. In this quiet, patient unfolding, humans discovered the true power of storytelling, the ability to preserve knowledge, shape behavior, and connect minds across both space and time.
Stories evolved, not just to teach or connect, but to inspire and ignite imagination. Humans began to fill the gaps in their understanding with narrative. A storm, mysterious and fierce, was not merely a natural occurrence. It became a story of forces beyond comprehension, spirits, guardians, or lessons hidden in the sky. Animals were no longer just creatures to hunt or avoid. They became characters in stories. Clever foxes, strong bears, swift birds, each represented traits humans admired, feared, or wished to emulate. These stories carried meaning far beyond the immediate. They offered hope when the night seemed too long, comfort when loss was heavy, and courage when the unknown loomed. Myth and imagination allowed humans to experiment safely. They could test ideas about life, morality, and consequence without physical danger. A tale of a trickster who outsmarted a predator taught problem solving. A fable of a hero facing impossible odds demonstrated bravery. Even as stories grew fantastical, they remained connected to the real world. The same trees, rivers, and mountains appeared in tales, grounding imagination in lived experience. Humans learned to see the extraordinary within the ordinary, to find meaning and beauty in the landscapes around them. Stories also nurtured empathy. By imagining the lives of others, humans practiced understanding. They could feel joy, fear, or sorrow for someone who had never existed, yet through narrative, these feelings became real and shared. Storytelling became a craft. The teller learned rhythm, cadence, and subtle emphasis. They knew where to pause, when to repeat, when to draw listeners into the quiet tension of a moment. Listeners learned patience, attention, and reflection, and together they created a shared emotional experience that no single individual could hold alone. The line between reality and imagination blurred. People began to see life as layered, the physical, immediate world and the world of stories that reflected, shaped, and guided it. Through myths, humans explored the fundamental questions. Why does the sun rise? Why do rivers flow? Why do people suffer yet endure? Stories offered answers, not always literal, but meaningful. And these stories moved across time. They were told around fires, through songs, through dance, through subtle gestures. Each telling added texture, detail, or nuance, yet the core remained. The story carried guidance, emotion, and inspiration. Communities began to recognize certain stories as sacred. They were honored during rituals or passed down during significant events.
Even the act of telling became ceremonial, a bridge between generations. Through imagination, humans expanded their sense of possibility. They envisioned worlds beyond the visible. They created ideas about fairness, morality, courage, and love. Even failure, conflict, and loss became lessons woven into narrative. Stories inspired innovation. By imagining solutions to impossible problems, humans could test strategies before acting. By telling stories of what could be, they prepared minds for what might come. Humans also learned perspective through story. A tale of someone from another tribe, another village, or another land allowed listeners to imagine life beyond themselves. This quiet exercise of empathy strengthened social bonds and expanded understanding. Even small communities felt the power of myth. A single story, shared repeatedly, could shape the way people behaved, thought, and remembered. It could unify, warn, inspire, or console. It could transform fear into caution, despair into resilience, confusion into insight. And so imagination became inseparable from survival. It was not frivolous, it was essential. A story imagined and shared today might guide action tomorrow. Over generations, the cumulative weight of stories formed culture itself. Patterns emerged, not imposed by a ruler or teacher, but organically through repeated storytelling. Songs, dances, ceremonies, and legends became the tapestry of human life. The storytellers, in turn, were revered. They held the power of memory, imagination, and moral guidance. But they also understood responsibility. A story told carelessly could mislead, frighten, or harm. A story told with care could preserve wisdom, nurture hope, and bind a community together. And still, the stories never became static. They shifted with each telling, adapted to each audience, and incorporated new lessons, experiences, and imagination. Through myth, humans explored the unseen forces that shaped their world. Through legend, they preserved achievements and warned of dangers. Through tale, they connected past, present, and future. And in the quiet of night, by firelight or starlight, humans discovered that imagination itself was a shared gift. Stories allowed them to transcend immediate experience, to see beyond survival, to understand themselves, others, and the world in richer, deeper ways. By inspiring, guiding, and expanding the mind, stories became a living framework for culture, ethics, and creativity. They were the first bridge between thought and action, between memory and invention, between the ordinary and the extraordinary. And even as the night grew long and listeners drifted into rest, the stories lingered, quietly, persistently, shaping the next day, the next generation, the next imagination. In these gentle, patient unfoldings, humans realized to tell a story was to create life beyond the present. To listen to a story was to inherit wisdom. And together, storyteller and listener wove a future grounded in memory, identity, and imagination. Stories were not only about the present. They were vessels carrying the past into the future. As humans aged, as generations passed, stories became legacy. They preserved what was important, what had been learned, what mattered most for life and survival. An elder might recount the journey of a river's flood.
A younger listener would remember not only the path to safety, but also the care, courage, and choices that had kept the group together. Stories became the guides for behavior, for wisdom, for values. They taught respect for the land, for animals, for each other. They taught patience, courage, and compassion. They taught which paths to follow, which actions to avoid, and why certain rituals mattered. Through repetition, these lessons became deeply embedded, not imposed as rules, but absorbed through attention, reflection, and experience. A story told at night in gentle tones lingered in the memory of the listener. It guided decisions the next day, the next week, the next season. Stories also preserved family and community history. Names, achievements, failures, and wisdom were all woven into narrative. They reminded each person of their place in a long chain, of the shared experiences that connected them to ancestors, neighbors, and descendants. Even when a person left or traveled far, the stories remained. They carried familiarity, belonging, and guidance to places unseen. Through story, a community could remain connected even across distance. They became the invisible thread linking generations and geographies. In these stories, humans also explored morality and consequence. Tales of greed, cruelty, or neglect warned quietly, without direct instruction. Tales of kindness, cooperation, and courage inspired emulation. Stories became a soft, enduring framework for understanding right and wrong. And the beauty of this was in the subtlety. No one dictated how one should feel or act. Instead, humans absorbed wisdom naturally, guided by narrative rhythm, character, and consequence. Stories also captured cultural identity. Songs, rituals, myths, and parables all reflected the shared understanding of a group. They provided a sense of continuity, a connection to the land, to ancestors, and to the collective imagination. Through storytelling, humans created a living record of experience. It was flexible, adaptive, and resilient. A story might shift slightly in wording or detail, but the lessons, emotions, and essence endured. Even minor events could take on significance when framed as narrative. A winter storm, a fortunate hunt, a communal celebration, all became part of the ongoing story of life. Each retelling reinforced memory, identity, and connection. Stories allowed humans to prepare for uncertainty. They could imagine what might happen, learn from what had happened, and act with foresight. A story of a failed hunt or an unexpected storm carried warning. A story of resourcefulness carried encouragement. Through narrative, humans trained minds and hearts alike. And as communities grew, stories helped unify multiple generations. Children learned from elders. Younger adults learned from experience shared in story. Even the oldest remembered anew as tales were retold and reshaped. Stories also became a repository of emotion. Grief, joy, hope, fear, pride, love, all were captured within narrative. By sharing these emotions, humans connected across age, time, and circumstance. The storyteller's role grew more revered. They were custodians of memory, wisdom, and identity. Yet they were humble, for the story itself belonged to the group, to the listeners, to the shared experience of life. Even as humans settled in villages, traveled far, and built civilizations, stories retained their quiet power. They were reminders that survival alone was not enough.
Life mattered not only for existence, but for meaning, for connection, for understanding. Stories shaped ritual and ceremony, often guiding action. Seasonal events, harvests, rites of passage, and communal celebrations all drew from narrative. Story provided context, grounding, and emotional resonance. It ensured that life's rhythms were observed, remembered, and respected. Through these practices, humans learned that stories were tools for continuity. They preserved knowledge, identity, and cultural memory. They guided behavior without coercion. They nurtured imagination while grounding it in shared experience. And as each new generation listened, repeated, and remembered, the stories became more than words. They became invisible scaffolds supporting human understanding, emotion, and society itself. Even when the fire faded, when the night deepened and the voices quieted, the stories lingered in memory. They shaped thought, inspired action, and offered guidance. They became the quiet heartbeat of human life, a rhythm spanning past, present, and future. And in these patient, gentle cycles, humans realized to tell a story was to preserve life beyond the immediate. To listen to a story was to inherit wisdom, and to live within a culture of stories was to belong to something enduring, a legacy of thought, feeling, and imagination that stretched across time. Stories, in their simplicity and depth, ensured that humans were never alone. They carried guidance, connection, and meaning through the generations. They transformed the ephemeral into the eternal.
Stories quietly became timeless. They were threads connecting one moment to the next, one generation to another. Through stories, humans reached beyond themselves. A tale told tonight might guide someone tomorrow. A story remembered by a child could shape choices decades later. Each word, each pause, each lesson quietly traveled through time. They connected humans to the past, to ancestors who walked the same land, faced similar dangers, celebrated the same wonders. Stories preserved their knowledge, their courage, their wisdom, their failures. They connected humans to each other. Listeners shared laughter, fear, awe, or wonder. Even in silence, the story resonated. It created understanding, empathy, and quiet companionship across ages and distances. Stories connected humans to the future. They offered guidance, inspiration, and reflection. They gave people the ability to imagine possibilities, to consider consequences, and to act with foresight. In this way, stories became more than entertainment. They were memory, morality, imagination, and connection all woven together. They were anchors in a world of uncertainty. They were companions in solitude, teachers in learning, and bridges between people. Even the smallest stories held weight. A tale of kindness could ripple across time. A fable of patience could shape a generation. A myth of courage could inspire action long after the storyteller had left the firelight. Humans began to understand that stories were living things. They adapted with each telling, absorbing new experiences, reflecting changes in the world, yet preserving the core of wisdom and meaning. Stories allowed humans to explore possibilities safely. Through narrative, they could confront fears, imagine triumphs, or rehearse difficult decisions. They created mental space for reflection, problem-solving, and empathy. And as civilizations grew, stories became culture itself. They shaped songs, rituals, laws, and art.
They marked important moments, guided communities, and reminded humans of their place in a larger, interconnected web of life. Even in modern times, stories continue this quiet work. Though written, recorded, or spoken differently, their purpose remains the same: to connect, teach, inspire, and preserve. Stories are the invisible thread tying the human experience together. They remind us that survival is not enough, that understanding, empathy, imagination, and reflection are what give life depth and continuity. When a story is shared, it is not just a momentary act. It becomes a living bond between teller and listener, between past, present, and future, between one human heart and another. And in the stillness of night, as voices fade, as firelight dims, as minds drift toward rest, the story remains. It lingers quietly, like the soft echo of footsteps in a familiar place. It carries meaning, memory, and wisdom onward. Through stories, humans discovered something essential, that to tell, to listen, and to remember is to create life beyond the immediate. That stories are the threads of human continuity, quietly binding us across time. That imagination, reflection, and shared experience are the true inheritance we pass forward. And so, the act of storytelling, simple, gentle, and enduring, remains one of humanity's most profound gifts. It shapes who we are, who we were, and who we may yet become. In every whisper, every pause, every memory retold, stories continue their quiet journey. They are timeless, they are human, and they are eternal.